Now we move into a whole new phase. The next conflict, I call it number 5, is real property versus personal property. The federal government has made this a mandate that they participate with real property, basically in the Constitution. Personal property is a debate. So we cleared the air on that one. And I said, how do you view this sign? I mean, it's my sign company. My name is on each one of the signs. Is it personal property or is it real property? There is no question. This is real property. Will there be a debate within the appraisal department about that? He says, no, there will not be. Great. So there's no conflict. Am I right? Yes, you're right. But now it gets down to the real nitty-gritty part. And that is the basis of this appraisal. You can do it by capitalization, where you work out the cash flow of the sign and you project it over a certain period of time and you work out a figure of what it's worth. I'm against that because it will vary and not necessarily to my advantage, but maybe not necessarily to your advantage. What do you recommend? I'm not an appraiser. But it looks like to me it's this, that to determine the value of that sign, what would it cost to build that same sign under today's figures and reproduce that sign exactly as it is? How much would that cost? Versus to replace that sign. It's like a house. If you're going to buy some property to build a highway, you can say to the house owner, we'll replace it, and they get screwed because they replace it with something far inferior to what they had. And they say, well, but your house is not worth any more. So now they go from the little comfortable home that they had and everything to something that is far less in value to them, and on we can go. So what I'm saying is we got to reproduce it, those 7 signs. He says, I agree. But I can tell you right now, not everyone in that department will agree with that one. But I think that I can make the case, and I think I can prevail on that. I'm glad to hear that you agree with that approach, because that was what I intended to do in the first place. So I really am grateful that you would speak up like this. It helps me, Doug, to find out where you're coming from. So what we have next is these reproduction costs. What does that consist of? There's 2 areas. One is the direct costs, which you would probably say would be the variable costs. That is the lumber, that's the paint, that's the cost to put that sign up, that all of that, everything incidental to that sign. Now the reason I say variable, because if you build 10 signs, it costs, each one it would vary, because you're only going to spend money on 10 signs. So it's a variable cost factor. Versus, let's say, 150 signs. You're going to spend a lot more money to build 150 signs, but each sign will still be basically the same. So that's why they're called variable costs. But it's direct costs. But, Jack, what about the indirect costs? Overhead, heat, light, water, secretary, all these indirect rent for the building. All of these costs. That's a huge number. And you have to take, when you build these signs, you have to take and ask yourself, how much of this do I add to the cost of the sign in the first place in order to know how much to price the sign at so that I can make a profit? So it's indirect costs and direct costs. He says, this will be the biggest argument of all. But you're absolutely right on that. I said, well, it's actually a real cost. Indirect cost is as much a real cost as direct costs when it comes right down to it. Because if I don't have this building to work out of, and I'm not paying rent and all this, I don't have anything in the first place. He said, you're right. I'm making this as simple as possible so you can understand. So what it boils down to is that Jack was coming to an understanding that the entire appraisal world will be against him. They'll pick at him. He knows that going in. Now, there'll be some among the appraisal world that'll say, well, I think maybe he did it right. But if they're tied in with the government, they're not going to agree with him. This will be a hard sell with the government because they'll say we're overpaying for the signs because of the indirect costs. So Jack was against. His battles was not just him. It's not just in this little appraisal department, Utah State Highway Department. It was against every doggone state out there. That's what the battle was. 50 states. I don't think we had 50 states then, but you get the idea. Now, in my case, I had to battle with 13 states, knowing full well that if a highway beautification bill was ever implemented, which right now is deader than a doornail, but the effect of that bill is destroyed my business because of the bank. And so now I have to battle, assuming that we can get through authorization, appropriation, allocation, and guidelines. The guidelines are going to have to be written, and then the appraisal process takes place. There are no guidelines. So I said to Jack, you and I are going to write those guidelines right here. When it comes to determining the price of a sign in the entire United States, we're going to write those guidelines right here. You and me are going to write them. So, Snarr versus 13 states plus the federal government, which is the House of Representatives, which is the Senate, which is the President, and which is also underneath the President is the Department of Transportation. Well, the Department of Transportation has already expressed themselves. They went up to Congress and told Congress that we're not going to have to pay 1 penny to those sign company owners for those signs, because we're going to give them a 4.5 years depreciation. and we're not going to have to pay a penny. That Secretary of Transportation lied to Congress, which should not surprise anyone that knows anything about government. Well, that was before Doug Snarr came on the scene. And Jack Francis came on the scene. And I had the Utah Department of Highways in my grasp of my fist because there was a bunch of caterpillars out there wanting to knock down those signs, and they knew doggone well they better not knock down those signs, but they have the right to knock down those signs because they gave them this document that says that property was free of encumbrances. But Doug Snarr had that lease, 7 of them. And I told him, you better not touch a sign. So they had to move, regardless. And so they decided that they're going to do it. And so this conflict kind of boiled down to Douglas T. Snarr needs Jack Francis, and Jack Francis needs Douglas T. Snarr. That's sure a lot better than an argument, isn't it? Be thou familiar. Be thou familiar, but by no means vulgar, is what Shakespeare wrote. Vulgar is an argument. Familiar friends coming together, even though they're on the other side of the desk from each other. And one's from the state, and one's has a sign company with billboards in 13 states. What happened was that the state bought my signs. Jack and I came to terms. It included the indirect costs, included the direct costs. We came together on all those points because he knew I was right. There was no exaggeration. I wasn't trying to get rich on this deal. I cared less about the money. I cared about the precedent. The precedent. It establishes the only place in America with a precedent. That's what I cared about. And the methodology used to arrive at the value pursuant to a billboard. Now, the reason we came together is because I had the numbers. I kept a record on each individual sign, cost accounting. One man lined up, just maintaining the cost of these billboards as they were built and put in place, to keep me on the right track so that I wouldn't go broke by not charging enough for the signs, and giving me an idea. Do I have to sell harder because I'm charging more than the next guy? That was the case in every sign. Per square foot, I charged a lot more. My signs were, they had a little personality. They were unique. So, in this context, buying these 7 signs, I had something that all of a sudden, my mind, kind of like Lord Northcliffe said, the guy that was the head of the Daily Mail newspaper in England, to foresee is to rule. And I saw exactly what could happen from this to some extent, not completely. And so here I saw opportunity. What's the opposite from opportunity is destruction. Opportunity is positive, destruction is negative. So there's a tipping point. I'd reached a tipping point right in my little office in Salt Lake City with the Jack Francis and Doug Snarr. If it tips in the positive way, I have a chance. If it tips in the wrong way, I'm destroyed. I knew that. So I'd like to discuss briefly opportunity. There's a poem written about that subject. What opportunity really means is it's a favorable timing. Timing is everything in life, and in so many cases. It's timing. Well, opportunity is when that timing is in a favorable context, as opposed into an unfavorable or a destructive context. So now we understand that term right there. I like Edward R. Sill's poem on the subject. It's a short poem because it's a story, and I could understand that. This I beheld, or dreamed in a dream. There spread a cloud of dust along a plain, and underneath that cloud, or in it, raged a furious battle. And men yelled, and swords shocked upon swords and shields. A prince's banner wavered, then staggered backward, hemmed in by foes. Now, a coward hung along the battle's edge and thought, had I a sword of keener steel, that blue blade that the king's son bears, but this blunt thing, he snapped and flung it from his hand, and lowering himself, he crept away and left the field. Then came the king's son, wounded, sore bestead, weaponless. He saw the broken sword of the coward, hilt buried in the dry and trodden sand. And he ran and snatched it and shouted boldly, lifted afresh, and hewed the enemy down and saved a great cause, that heroic day. If anyone was without a weapon, really, and no experience, didn't have a clue how government works, didn't take time to even try and find out because I was so busy selling, building billboards, dealing with banks, it was me. And then when I get into the battle, I just don't have a weapon. Don't have the weapon. But what Jack Francis was in the state of Utah was that blunt, broken sword. Give me a lever long enough and I can rule the world. I think that's how it goes. Well, I didn't have a lever long enough by any means. I had a toothpick, but that was better than nothing. So a toothpick can move so much, but I had that contract. Now I had to make my play. So what do I do with this contract? Another little poem on on opportunity. that I've loved. And this poem is by John James Ingalls. I could never understand this poem when I was just a little kid. I first read it when I was in high school. I couldn't understand it at all. But boy, I could understand it when this was happening. And the poem, I'm not going to quote the poem, I'm going to just a few excerpts from the poem, because I've never memorized the poem before. But the first line, master of human destinies am I. Opportunity. Master of human destinies am I. Fame, love, and fortune on my footstool wait. The key word there is wait. You have to be patient. It's going to unfold in a somewhat of a logical sequence. I didn't know how, but I like that line. I knock unbidden once at every gate. Once. I knock unbidden once at every gate. If sleeping, wake. I like that. Wake up, Doug. Wake up. It is the hour of fate. What does the word fate mean? It means it's inevitably decreed. That's one of the connotations. It's a cause that takes place beyond one's control. Fate determines events. This whole thing that happened with Utah, I could never think of it. It just happened. Take down those 7 signs in a letter. Changed my life. Just like that. Changed my life. I answer not. I return no more. Fate says. There is an hour of fate. Well, that means there's a beginning point and there is an ending point. And fate necessarily doesn't mean it exists in various lengths of time. But who's to know? But by gosh, if you're asleep, you better wake up and take advantage of every moment. Because I answer not. I return no more. It's there or it's gone. You got that moment. So you got to take it.